when we first came out of the session, we were thinking, oh, it's going to be quite cool to bring together Ruben, who I think many of you would already know, with Mr. Toh from Dunman Secondary. And we were thinking, okay, we had a pretty tight timeline, about 3 weeks of the event. Let's just send it out. And we thought, okay, maybe we'll get like 30 people come. But within 2 days, we actually got 70 plus signups. And by now, we actually have I think 125 people that signed up for the session. So it's going to be quite a fun session, and I look forward to be going with the program today. I just really wanted to start with giving us a little bit of context behind this session. And I promise this first 10 minutes will be the most that I speak today. Most of us are here for Mr. Toh and Ruben, so I will be just a bit of a facilitator at the background. So first, I want to start with thanking each and every one of us for your thoughtful participation in the survey. Most times when we send surveys, we get 3 or 4 word responses. We actually got really long essays this time during our surveys, and that's really wonderful. And we actually got 131 responses from 57 schools in Singapore. And this includes 26 primary schools, 24 secondary schools, some higher ed institutions, and also some special education schools that signed up for this session. Now, we also did a bit of a summary behind the themes. I will not be going through every single one of these themes because Ruben will be going through them in more detail later on. But I just really wanted to put a little close to the loop on the surveys. And these 9 things were really what stood out in the surveys. We were thinking a lot about how we are integrating technology for that better human connection. A lot of us, of course, are thinking about AI and how, the ethics of AI and how we're going to use it in our classrooms. Well, how does that change the dynamics that we have in our teaching and learning, right? And of course, the central theme that we have today is the evolution of the teacher's role. How are we going to teach and learn in this new world of AI? And also, of course, with that human connection that we're trying to build. You might have noticed that in the slides, I actually included that there are some people from MOE HQ today. I just wanted to just say that every one of us gave really thoughtful responses, and we are participating not as the officers that we are, but actually as innovators and practitioners. So I hope this gives a little bit of context behind who's in the room. Again, the 57, 58 schools that are on board today. Great. So I'm going to give us more context around HoloTracker and why we're hosting this event first. And very quickly, then we'll start off the session with a little kind of get to know each other. So from the HoloTracker's perspective, I always want to say that our tool is really about supporting. You can't support what you don't observe, right? And today, I think many of us are facing this disconnect with that visibility and connection in learning. Some of this would be very familiar to all of us, where we are, I think, actually right now in the thick of the season of writing all our reports and surveys around justifying how our students are growing holistically. And many times this takes the joy out of a very fulfilling process, right? With HoloTracker, some of our schools tell us, in truth, we pretend to evaluate and we're not that good at giving meaningful feedback. Now, thinking about the themes that we have been talking about in our survey questions, I think all of us are driving towards better student connection. But so many processes behind the tech always kind of almost slow us down instead of quicken us or make it more meaningful in the process. So really, we're a tool that tries to achieve that visibility and connection. Later on, we will get a taster of the tool. We will be using this as part of the session today. But I like to say that we try and revolutionize the way that we give feedback to our students through affirmations and real-time insights. We'll get a hang of the tool, but basically there are 2 screens where every time you observe something, you will observe that for your student. And then later on, we use AI to synthesize some of these insights. These are some examples from our trackers in schools. You see here that there's a mix of student trackers and as well as our teachers from around the world in Brazil and also in Ukraine, where we're deployed. And it's really wonderful to see how students and teachers are really interacting on the platform. This is a little story from our special school in Cerebral Palsy Alliance, and I think what's really wonderful is that using real observations, not really the tech, but really the intentionality behind the teacher giving observations for our students creates this idea that, hey, the report writing doesn't need to be so cold. It can be something that can be warm, personalized, and personable. Right. So this is the last thing I'll share about HoloTracker. So as we thought about this event, we launched in 2017 a prototype. In 2022, we started getting schools on board. This is Dunman Secondary, and I was just looking through the pictures before the session. And Mr. To, we actually had a time where we were designing the app when it was not fully fledged yet. And I think that was really wonderful to see. We also have right now in 2023 and 2024 now rollouts in 8 different countries. And this was actually when I met Ruben in December last year when we were working together in Sao Paulo for a learning conference. Right. So one more thing before I go on to the main stage with the curtains about to be open. I want us to really start thinking a little bit about our experience today, right? So a lot of this session is going to be quite collaborative. And we're going to really jump into a little breakout room right after this, where we're going to speak about these 3 questions, right? So for those who are savvy, I would encourage us to maybe take a screenshot. I will put this also in the chat in a little bit, but I'll give us 1 minute to take a quick screenshot, right? I'll count down, okay, maybe 20 seconds. I don't think we need a minute to take the screenshot. Right. And in a bit, I'm going to send us into breakout rooms, right? And I will ask us also to think about this, right? So I will ask us to try out using HoloTracker in the breakout rooms. We'll be using HoloTracker as our companion here. I'm going to ask us to scan this QR code that you see on the screen. Your username will be the email that you signed up with, right? For schools that are on HoloTracker already, please add a WB/ for Workbench, right? Because we had to create a separate account for this session, and your password will all be HoloTracker. Right. I'm going to give us a minute or so to do this, and this will guide the rest of the session that we have today.
I need to decide on one and build on it.
Right. So everyone managed to log in. Maybe I'll ask us to give me a thumbs up or a nod if you have been able to. Awesome. I see some thumbs up. I'm going to go ahead with the process, and then later on, we can come back to help those that are a little bit behind. Right. So this is how it's going to work. On HoloTracker, when you log in, you will be seeing. Okay, actually, let me use this slide first. We'll be seeing this page, right? So the first page is basically your observe page. This is where you make observations and reflections across the session. And when you come into this page, you should see everyone in this room. You will be on the top left, okay? So if for me, I'm Ik, I put myself on the top left, you should see your own name. I'll tap my own name if I'm making a reflection for myself. And I'll tap one of these clusters. So these are 4 clusters that we have synthesized from the surveys. And let's say I go with evolving roles of the teacher, and I say, I'm inspired by how teachers have creatively used technology in the last 2 years, right? And then I press submit, and that's an observation made, right? So I'm going to ask us to try and do this in our breakout rooms later on. The idea is that as we are discussing with our friends, we will then be using this as a platform to make some observations and synthesize them later on. To turn our attention now to our 2 main facilitators today, right? So maybe I'll do a short introduction. We have with us Mr. To, who will be taking on the first part of this session, and then later on with Ruben. Maybe you can say hi to everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chai
Good
here.
afternoon, everyone.
Great. And Ruben has very kindly joined us from something like 3:30 a.m. where he is right now. So yeah, thank you both for being here. Just to explain the arc of today's session, what I've just done is to do a little bit of context setting. We will then have Dunman share from their school's perspective what is happening at Dunman, followed by Ruben's observations and insights. As we saw in the last 5 minutes, this will be quite a conversational session. So we will have 3 breakout rooms later on where we will get deeper into these topics. And again, we will be using HoloTracker to track some of the insights that we've gathered. Right, without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Mr. To, and yeah, have a great sharing.
Right. Thanks, Ik. Maybe let me get to my slides and see whether I can replicate. Not sure whether are you seeing the slides. Let me try again. Right. Okay. Right. A very good afternoon to all of you. It's my pleasure. It's the first time I've had this collaboration with Ik as well as Ruben, and it's been very exciting. And we thought that before we go deeper, and this is the first time we've actually conducted a workbench that is very interactive as well as hands-on, minds-on. So we thought that maybe perhaps to set the context of how we can reimagine the teacher's role in EdTech 2030, we could sort of like share a few case studies. We over at Dunman, we don't claim that we have all the solutions, but the caveat here is that we thought maybe perhaps with the case studies that we are sharing, that it may help as a fodder for deeper discussions later. So in the backdrop of Master Plan Tech 2030, there are questions such as like, are we, as what I mentioned in my own reflection just now in the HoloTracker, are teachers playing a catch-up game of sorts? And within the master plan, you have the different strata from students to teachers to school to system. But then for teachers here, under that of technological adept, collaborative learning designers, do all teachers need to know coding to be technologically adept? Do schools have to have the latest digitally equipped learning environment to be intelligent and responsive? And the question that begs it sometimes as in, yeah, we've heard of network groups and so on, but what does a network EdTech ecosystem look like? So with that as a backdrop with special skills future for educators as well, we thought maybe perhaps from Dunman's perspective, we looked at that of the 4 scenarios for future of schooling, since schooling for the future, preparing the kids for the future is the main crux of WorkBench seminar for the last few years. And we do want to actually see that from Dunman's perspective, we were experimenting. As a DT STEM school, we were trying out things like, what would education look like if it's outsourced? What would schools look like if it acts as a learning hub? Now, when we talk about outsource, and when we talk about teachers having quite a plate full or overflowing of things on their plates, how then can we tap on public resources, community resources, to be able to actually look into it? So just one of the models that we were trying out, and we're already in the 3rd edition, is that in the process of putting that up and so on, we were actually looking at what exactly are the fundamentals that needs to be relooked at, to be re-examined. Because while we want to modernize, while we want to keep up with the times, what exactly are the other distractors and disruptors? And are there old structures that are still in existence, that's such as, learning must only take place in school, but while we bring the kids out for learning journey and all, Are there other ways in which we can actually attain the new goals by relooking at how structures, is it just the physical structure of the schools, or can we go beyond? But more importantly, the challenge that we face whenever we want to innovate is teachers asking, so what's the bandwidth or allowance for failure? And there's this risk averse, especially if the schools have done relatively well, the kids are doing well as well, then by trying out new initiatives, would that act as a risk to the school's status, or maybe even perhaps the outcomes that we have actually envisioned? So when we started having this conversation with Temasek Poly, and they were saying that, okay, now currently going to different schools to help to get the programs running and so on, to see what the schools want and so on. Then when we counter propose a value proposition, that what happens if you're able to sponsor one of your lecturers from your school of IT over to a secondary school, just to try out for starters. With 30 students, those who are very keen, interested in technology. And they also made mention that there has been a progressive rise of students that have chosen the wrong course and then decided to maybe perhaps drop it, and they're trying to arrest the attrition rate. So for win-win situation, then I made mention that why not we get the students or the lecturers to come over, we start a pilot, you curate the actual material based on the level or age group of secondary school kids. And with those itself, what exactly would they be learning? They'll be learning things such as that AI, analytics, and be able to create a dashboard that then can then be used as a portfolio for admission, for advanced placement in that of JCs, including that of polytechnics, any polytechnics. So then started our journey. This were into our third iterations. And when we shared this idea with that of our cluster schools, 2 more schools came on board. And with that itself, they had online blended learning, as well as that of over at Dunman, everybody converging at Dunman. And together with the lecturer from Temasek Poly, they were able to identify and grow the students in their IT interest. And although the initial part was pretty challenging because my timetable is different from another school's timetable, but we eventually made it work. And what then has become the role of the teacher? Is it just a chaperone to bring the kids over? Or will there be more conversations that will take place pertaining to how the students are going to transfer these data analytics skill sets back to the school setting? So that, in a nutshell, was what we tried out in outsourcing the education to the community, for the community to come into the school to make the school a learning hub where the other schools can then converge. And the challenge then was that how then can I interest more schools tying up with different schools over at the polytechnics to be able to set up models like this, especially where we're very manpower scarce and time scarce as well. And then what we did was we also looked at that of how, if we're talking about evolving teachers' role and function, what kind of autonomy do we give the teachers in terms of exploring, and how can we go about in doing that? And here, one of the teachers, because they were actually wondering, okay, we have this particular project with Classroom of the Future. What it does is that it detects the kind of mood. So before I start the lesson, let's find out what's the mood of the class like before I start the lesson. And in this example, the chart, a higher proportion of students express that they're feeling anxious and stressful. So should I continue with the lesson, or should I just take a step back and then explore what exactly is causing the stress? And then from there itself, we explored that of peer power study with NIE. And this actually arose when there was another school, that Edgefield, if I'm not mistaken, who shared this socialgram. And then so happens that NIE was conducting similar so-called research using the socialgram, where we were actually looking into that of how do we look at students from the inside out. What is their perception of their friends around them? And when they did a very quick survey of, oh, these are my number of friends that, and I do believe majority of the school leaders here are very familiar with it, you'll then be able to identify the social isolates and then be able to embark on intervention measures and then relook at that particular sociogram again to see whether your intervention is working or not. Now, what about then? How then do I get the feedback in the fastest possible time? From the sociogram is my perception of how others see me, but can I have a confirmation, maybe perhaps through another app that allows the other students to then be able to give me an affirmation of a certain strength that I'm having. And maybe along the lines, if there is AI working behind it, would it then be able to consolidate all the views, whether it is from peer to peer, whether it is from teacher to student, or sometimes we were tricky, we actually did a teacher and on teacher, that means giving feedback on each other. So you can see that how the HoloTrack was able to customize it based on whether you want to look at the values, do you want to look at 21cc, do you want to look at that of CC 2021? What exactly would be the skill sets that we're looking at? But more importantly, the challenge that the teachers had when we were embarking on this is how do you teach teachers to make good observations? The quality of the actual feedback is as good as the quality of the observation that was made, be it by the teacher or by their peers. But maybe perhaps if they have been trained and are able to do a better job at that, they might be a better person ultimately in terms of self-reflection of, is that how others see me? And how then would I be able to morph myself? And maybe one last example, when we make mention about EdTech, network ecosystem, how does it look like? So if I have a group of very passionate HODs and they would like to come together because we have adopted during the COVID period, the iPad as the personal learning device. So when these four heads came together, they not necessarily are restricted by their zones, clusters. They just got together, and because of the passion and so on, they were wondering whether could they actually have a camp for the kids, a tech champ camp, so as to be able to, and whatever that schools name their kids, whether it's a PDLP ambassadors or tech champs, what is most important is how then do I allow the students to not just use it for T&L, but how could I introduce certain teams, certain apps that they could then come up with to be able to make the teaching and learning a little bit more fun and enjoyable. So that was the birth of 2022, where we have the inaugural camp for these four schools to come together. And then that team for that year was on cyber wellness. And come 2023, they were looking at food and tech sustainability, where they used the AR, VR affordance of the iPad. And then in partnership with that of NitaTech, which is an agri-tech company, they were actually using the AR, VR, learning just in time, and then in partnership with that of NitaTech. Come 2024, they were looking at AI for sustainable future, where they learned about that. The digital literacy skill sets was AI, machine learning, coding, and even drones. And we're very lucky to have Apple to be the sponsor of this particular venture. And the impact that it has, I must say, is really astounding. Where we started with 4 schools, together with industrial partners, and it has since expanded to 300 participants with 120 tech champs. Now, is that the power of EdTech network ecosystem? Does it need to be organically achieved, or can it be very strategically aligned? So with that in mind, I thought it would be quite interesting for you to actually think through about today's key themes, about how we are able to reimagine the role of the teacher in the various areas. What exactly is the role of the teachers in a tech-driven era? Has it changed? How has it changed? And maybe perhaps as a link up to what Ruben is about to share, how relevant is this SAM-R model? Is it going to be a substitution, or is it going to be an augmentation, or modification, or even a redefinition? And could that be applied to teachers? Can teachers be substituted? Can they be augmented? Or vice versa, the other way around? How can tech enable them to be able to bring a lot more value into teaching, what could previously could not be done? And with that itself, I leave you to your deliberations and thought before we go on to the next segment with that of Ruben. So I hope that you've enjoyed the very quick sharing session and some food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. To. And I think it's well apt that you landed on that point, because I see in the chat that our AI note taker is a little bit confused whether there's someone talking, and clearly this is a role that our teachers still have to play. Looking at reading the room and seeing what's happening in our dynamic. Now, I want to invite soon Ruben to make some observations from Mr. To's sharing. But before we do that, I just want to just quickly jump here again. I will be reminding us every now and then to make some observations. So the second question I'll ask us is, what is one practice from your school that you are reminded of as you are hearing Dunman's sharing? Right. So think about this. We can share them on HoloTracker, and you can already see that people are coming up with some reflections. See this as your back channel of sorts. Right. With that, Ruben, may I perhaps invite you to take the floor?
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you, Mr. Toad. That was an amazingly rich sharing. And let me just highlight a few key points that I'd like people to keep in mind. The first one is that what you've just heard is a description of a whole person approach to learning. This is essential. This is really, really important. It is not an approach that just says, well, you have a student is sort of a bucket you pour learning into, and that's it. No. This is a very rich approach, and it's a whole person approach. And sometimes you'll hear from people, well, whole person approach, it's nice, but is that something that we need to do? I think you're going to see as I get deeper into my presentation that not only is it something we need to do, it's something we must do. But I also want to highlight from Mr. To's sharing, he mentioned the OECD scenarios, and he mentioned also some of the other work. I want to emphasize that the OECD is focusing on whole person learning, again, not just because it would be nice, desirable, rich life, good life, but also because all those other indicators that the OECD has been traditionally concerned with in the PISA measurements, as well as the bigger economic picture, all of them all turn out to be tied into as well, into this whole person approach. And if you go to the PISA site, there's a huge number of resources. They're building out the website. It's nicknamed the Happy Life website, but it's got a wealth of information and information about students' education, PISA, and these multiple dimensions that have to do with safety, with engagement, with inclusion in a community, with friendship. All of these are beginning to show up as key factors. So this is something very important from Mr. To's sharing that I want to take. A second aspect that I'd like to take is the fact that the role of the teacher is changing, but it's not going away, right? So we have these blended platforms. We have experts coming in, the Temasek partnership. You have all of these opportunities, but this isn't a world where we're talking about, let's get rid of the teacher in favor of this plus a screen. This is a world that when people ask me, is that what you want of the world? The answer is, God, I can't think of anything less appealing, less interesting, and less powerful as an idea for how a student could learn as this sort of isolated world. I want to think of a world where teachers interact richly in new roles, in new ways, that brings out the best things they can do, while at the same time we start talking about doing new things, and we're going to see why in just a second when I get my presentation. So that's the second aspect I want to highlight from the sharing about the experience at Dunman. And finally, last but far from least, I do want to get back to the amazing tool that is HoloTracker and the use that you're seeing being made of it in different contexts. But you just heard Dunman, when Ike mentioned that we met in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, and I was flabbergasted with what I saw the tool being able to do. I mean, it was kind of, yes, that's exactly what I want. That's exactly what we all need in education, because it gives us a rich way to really record, share, and start to create exactly what Mr. To is talking about, where we talk about not just a top-down approach while the teacher observed this about the students, but an interactive approach, and one that can be used to support and develop new forms of social interaction, better forms, ones that are richer, more encouraging, safer. All of these things become possible. And I'll talk a bit more about this. But again, these are some key takeaways, and I do want to emphasize this whole person learning not as an accidental or additional or just nice, but an essential portion of the picture. So with that, let me get to what I want to talk about from my perspective, which builds upon what you've heard so far. And the first thing I want to do is emphasize that I want this to be practical. I want this to be something you take away and you use. This is not intended to be just listen and that's it. We are going to be doing activities. We'll talk about those later that will hopefully help you leverage what you're about to hear in useful and creative ways. And because it's important for you to have access, not just now, but also when you go back to be able to share with others, one thing I'm going to put in the chat is my slides are, I always make my slides for any presentation I give available under a Creative Commons license, which means you should feel free to share, reuse, share with other people, reuse the material, please. I put them there so you don't have to worry about, oh, I didn't catch that or I couldn't quite see it on my screen. Don't worry. You've got the PDF. It's a high-res PDF. You can look at it there. As long as you like at your leisure, you won't need it right now, although there are some other resources that you will be using for your breakout sessions later on. But I want to make sure that from the very start, you understand that this is available. The second thing I want to say before I jump in is I want to talk about then this with, I have my chat window open. Feel free, please, to chat, type in questions, remarks, etc. I also have the HoloTracker window open, but I will admit at some point my multitasking starts to get a little overloaded. So for immediate questions, I'm going to encourage you to use the chat. I will, of course, look at comments, etc. reflections in HoloTracker as well. But all right, so let me share my slides then. And let's see, 1 second. So here we go, share. There we go. Yes, allow it. There we go. I believe you should all be now seeing my slides. I assume that is
Perfect.
correct. Wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about then what we're going to be looking at. And I want to start right off the bat with, this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening in a global context. And that global context is very complex. We just went through the pandemic. But people who were thinking about going a little bit further back may remember the global economic crisis of 2008. And in the middle, we've had recent events around the world of different kinds associated with climate change, ranging from shifts in the seasons at which typhoons, droughts, rain season occurs to other phenomena. So this is a context that is not a same day in, same day out type of context. This is a context where we have multiple changes. It's a context in which what are called black swan events, this is one of my areas of research, happen. And a black swan event is something that has 3 properties. First, it's highly impactful. In other words, it's not something that just happens and 2 people notice, but nobody cares. Second, it's something completely unpredictable. And third, while you couldn't predict it, when you analyze it in hindsight, you say, oh, yeah, that makes sense, right? And for instance, the example I always like to use, this illustration is courtesy of Karina Branson, who's an amazing illustrator, is the Titanic. Was it impactful? Not only did it make a change in terms of shipping, it made a change on everything from how radio communications work to how safety procedures work. Everything was transformed by the Titanic. Was it unpredictable? Yes, nobody thought that this ship like that could sink. In fact, it was considered unsinkable. People were clamoring to get tickets on that maiden voyage of the Titanic. It was, unthinkable that if you were passionate about boats, you wouldn't try to get on the maiden voyage. So nobody predicted, and yet we know what happened. And finally, in retrospect, you say, oh, yes, given the procedures, given everything, it made sense. but there was nothing that could have acted to predict it. So that's a black swan event. And what we're in a world is that is a world that's filled with things that are either black swan events or kissing cousins of them, which are called dragon kings. Dragon kings are much like black swans, except that they're not completely unpredictable. There are things like, for instance, the change in typhoons and hurricanes, which it's not that we haven't had typhoons and hurricanes before, but it's that this distribution of how many of them are strong, weak, etc., when they occur, etc., has shifted so dramatically that our capacity to predict has decreased dramatically. So they're not quite black swans, but close enough for our purposes. Okay, so this is a world that's filled with these black swans, etc. What do we have then? Are we just doomed to have to suffer and that's it? No, not really. We go with business as usual. We have a black swan event, and then three possible outcomes can occur. The lowest one is fragility. That's where you weren't in good shape to handle the black swan, and you either take serious damage or, frankly, you disappear. So that's fragility. Resilience is when you go through the black swan event, you may take some damages, but at the end of the day, you're pretty much the same way you were before. And that's what most people say. It's the kind of, made it through it type of approach. That's okay, but you really want to target the third. And the third is anti-fragility. Anti-fragility, when you go through a black swan event, you come out better than you went in. You can do more things, you can do different things, you have new skills that you didn't have before, new capabilities, new competencies you didn't have before. That does not mean that you didn't suffer, have hard times, etc. during the black swan event. It's not aren't pandemics great? No, they're not. They're horrible. But if you're going to be hit with a pandemic, you're much better being in the anti-fragile domain than in the resilient domain, and definitely much better in either of those than the fragile domain. So part of what we want to do is see how do we get schools, or how do we get people, our students, our families, our communities to be in either the resilient or the anti-fragile domain. And what I'm going to show you then is how to get to that, how to think about this. Again, this is an area of active research for me. It actually started before the pandemic. I was working on more dragon kings in some contexts, but the pandemic, of course, sadly, I wish it hadn't happened, but it did provide me with a natural laboratory for studying what happened in different contexts. And these are some of the things that come out. So the first thing is fragility is because when doing what you've always done, no matter how well you did it, it won't work when the world changes. Something is going to break. Resilience is when you you understand enough about what you've done, and you say, well, this is going to get hit by this black swan that hit in this way, so I can improve it, or I have improved it, or I have the capacity to improve it in such a way that I can sort of boost it. So even though it's going to take some damage, at the end of the day, even though it took some damage, because I boosted it, I come out pretty much the same way. And anti-fragility, you cannot just say in one dimension, you cannot just stay with just what you had before. It requires that you have an exploration domain for change in the process of the black swan that's multidimensional, and it has to go beyond simple improvement. Simple improvement, unfortunately, just gets you to resilience. It does not get you to anti-fragile. So the question is, you can always have a toolkit that can cover something. You can't predict everything because black swans are inherently unpredictable, but if your toolkit has the flexibility and richness to always modulate, cover, mutate, evolve, now you can get to anti-fragility. One more thing about this world. So I've talked so far about black swans on their own, but the truth of the matter is all of these events, black swans, complex issues, dragon kings, other aspects, are all in what's sometimes called the polycrisis. Okay, this term came into being. It came into being actually at the end of the previous century, but it's only been in common use for about a decade, give or take. But and the polycrisis refers to the fact that all of these risks, nesting grounds for black swans, as I like to call them, places where dragon kings dwell, etc., are interconnected. And you can't think of one without thinking of the other. So this is a diagram that's produced every year by the World Economic Forum. It's worthwhile downloading the entire report, and all of my slides, which you now have, they have the links, of course, the sources, so you can go and look at them. So they're calling this the global risk landscape. Again, I call this a map for the polycrisis. And just look at the different sources. You have economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, and technological, and subcategories within it. And each of those influence each other to different degrees. Each of them is more or less salient to different degrees. And different parts of the world see these in different ways. If you read the report, for instance, you'll find that Singapore sees more risk categories in the economic side than they do in the others. But that doesn't mean that they're free of the others. It just means that those become salient. And this is the world you have to be thinking about, that your students live in, that you live in, that your schools work in, that you're going to develop processes, etc. for. And that's part of the reason why we're doing hands-on work today. This is not the sort of thing where you say, I think I will teach a unit on, let's see, societal polarization next week, and I'll do it. It's not. You need to be thinking in this complex way. You need to be thinking how to get to anti-fragility. And yes, you need this schema of the polycrisis in the back of your minds. All right, Sam, there's the model that I developed. Some of you are familiar with, as I understand it, and also looking at the guest list. I know some people I know from past visits to Singapore. But one of the things about SAMR is it's a model that was developed to talk about the impact that uses of technology have upon learning outcomes. So very quickly, substitution, you use a technology the same way you used another tool, but you make no other changes to it. That can be great. It can be very useful, but it has no impact upon learning outcomes. And augmentation, you improve what you were doing before, but you don't change what you were doing. You have an ebook reader. If you're just using it to read paper books exactly the same way, you add substitution. If you use things like voice synthesis, collation of notes into separate documents, etc., now you're at augmentation. You're still reading for the same purposes with the same overall goals, etc., but the tool has improved how you can do that. Augmentation has small but measurable impacts upon learning outcomes. Modification, you're starting to redesign a task. You're saying, well, instead of having books be read individually by students that they write individual reports for, what about using social interaction tools for both online media, but also start thinking about how you could use something like HoloTracker to use interest groupings for students for different readings and so on. Now you're modifying the task. It's no longer individual reading with this very, certain track design focus. It's social reading, that now students are reading, sharing socially in a productive way that they haven't before. It doesn't completely create a new task. It redesigns the old task, however, significantly, because the audience is different for individual reading versus social reading, for reading that takes place within the confines of something that mimics a traditional book, versus reading where the text itself can become a social platform for commenting, annotating, etc. And that takes you to modification. And now we start to see roughly double the impact that we see at augmentation upon learning outcomes. And finally, at redefinition, we're creating a whole new task. We're saying, well, maybe instead of doing an exam or a traditional essay, won't we afford a range of possibilities to students based upon interests, goals, where they want to go next, and so on? So you might have students, for instance, choose to create some sort of a shared out video. In some cases, that's a very popular one, but it's not the only one by any stretch of the imagination. You might have the students instead create a community interaction as a response that is mediated by the technology in some crucial way. You might choose to have an even broader audience be brought to the foreground for a sort of summative approach to what the student has learned. Many, many possibilities, but these are whole new tasks that could not have been conceived or carried out without the technology. And that's at the redefinition level. And that's roughly double the impact of modification. So substitution, next to no impact; augmentation, small impact; redefinition, roughly double in term. Here's the thing. It turns out that SAMR also works in terms of thinking about anti-fragility. So if you think about how you use technology at each level of SAMR, and you say, well, what happens if I use the technology up to this level and stop there? Well, guess what? If you use the technology up to substitution only, you wind up with fragile solutions, okay? They're not bad necessarily, but a black swan comes along, and I hate to tell you this, but that's not going to save you from the wrath of the swan. At augmentation, you get resilient solutions. That's where you want to be in case that you say, well, I'd like to at least come out in roughly where I was before, after the black swan. But the real payoff is at modification redefinition. That's where the uses of the technology become anti-fragile or assist in finding anti-fragile paths. Does this mean that substitution is bad? Not in the least. It does mean, however, that if you just stay with substitution, you will not develop resilient or anti-fragile solutions. In other words, you should view substitutive uses of the technology as a transition to the higher levels that get you to at least resilience, ideally anti-fragility. So this is an additional aspect of SAMR that, as I say, was already coming out in research prior to the pandemic, but the research from all the data I managed to collect during the pandemic reinforces it very, very strong. So great. So we could use that, and we can go back to our old technologies, but there's a particular technology in the foreground right now, and it's AI, particularly in the form of generative AI. Machine learning is also there, and it plays an important role. And there are other forms of AI that also have a role to play, but the one that's in everybody's mind these days is generative AI. And the question is, so what does SAMR have to say about generative AI? Does it work in the context of generative AI? Spoiler, yes. It turns out it actually can be a very useful tool in the context of generative AI. But first, let's take the idea of generative AI, AI in general. So I am going to include a little bit of machine learning and other forms of AI into this picture and say, what does this look like in the world? Okay, first thing about the world. In the world as it exists, every single analysis that's a serious analysis of how AI impacts economics, the workplace, the marketplace, social interactions, etc., says something that's reinforced by this diagram here. Total task replacement, or total job replacement, I should say, of somebody's job by AI and other related forms of automation is relatively rare. It's those two peaks you see at the end. The least specialized jobs can be replaced. Some of the most specialized, although not the very most specialized jobs, can also be replaced. Everything else in between is in the domain of task modification or replacement. In other words, these are tasks that human beings are doing right now. They're going to continue to do some aspects of it, but some aspects are going to be changed by AI. Others are going to be modified. This is important because sometimes you'll hear, oh, all of these jobs are going to disappear because of AI. There is not an iota of evidence that, as you're going to do things terribly from an economic planning perspective, that is indeed a doomsday scenario will happen. It is true, however, that if you do not work with your population, do not work with the people who are in your schools now, with your teachers, with everybody, to make sure that they can handle the task modification and so on, then yes, you're going to have a problem. Then you're going to have people out of work, then you're going to have the patchwork all over the place with AI. That's a very bad scenario and should be avoided. So let me be clear. This is not something, it'll happen no matter what. That's not true. This is what can happen if we take the steps necessary for education, workplace development, etc., to engage with this. Okay, by the way, this diagram is for the US. It also holds, if you look at any studies since this was published, for any economy in the high income group, which of course Singapore is one of the leaders of. And it also holds, interestingly enough, for countries in the upper middle income group. It is less applicable to lower middle income group and dubiously applicable to countries in the low income group. So I mentioned that because there are questions of what type of a backdrop you're playing on. But if you're in an upper income country or in an upper middle income country, there's no question that this is the picture you're looking at. So a key principle in AI incorporation that derives from this, but you should see the language, it should start to remind you of this SAMR thing, SAMR, grow by a task modification and creation, not replacement. And that's not just the job place, that's not just the marketplace, it's you. It's you as the leader of your school. It's you as a teacher in your school. It's you as a student in the school. It's you as the school as an institution. It's you as the community that school is embedded in. It's how you incorporate, keep thinking not about replacing something in general. There are exceptions, but in general, follow the rule of growing by a task modification and task creation of new tasks that are enabled by the technology that you could not have done before. So, what does SAMR have to say then more specifically about AI? First, at substitution, use it with care. It's much weaker in the context of AI than at other levels. Our technologies have less of a split. AI has a huge split between substitution and the rest of the levels. So that's the first thing. And you want to focus on targeted replacement that allows you to do other things. The replacement itself doesn't change outcomes by itself, but if it frees up some time, that's what you're doing effectively here, or allows for some opportunities to take place that wouldn't take otherwise, it's a worthwhile replacement. So things like, for instance, you're talking about correcting students' papers for grammar that sort of thing, that type of basic correction, or finding certain errors, much more sophisticated ground, you can do that. You can do some automation of that. It doesn't eliminate the teacher, but it frees up some time in terms of some of the basics. And also detecting patterns, right? Good teachers know that they'll see a class and say, I've been teaching this math unit, and it's clear all my students are getting hitched, getting stopped really in terms of their progress by this part of the problem or this part of what I'm teaching. I'm going to be thinking, well, AI can help detect that. But these are basic low-level substitutions. I do not recommend replacing a task at straight substitution that was done before without the tool, without thinking, why am I doing this? What will this allow me to either gain time or do otherwise? Because in some cases, you can actually create erosion of student learning. And some of the people who have said, well, we'll just give them the same essay task and we'll just have them use the AI to write it and then say, do you like what the AI wrote? Yes or no? If no, have the AI rewrite it and we'll call it the date. That's terrible. Don't do that. It's a pointless task, frankly. So that base at substitution level really doesn't work for AI. At augmentation, though, things start to get easier or more powerful. And at the augmentation, we have a chance to reflect. So we have to rethink both the scope and depth of activities using AI. So we say, can the AI help our students, for instance, take on challenges that we didn't think they would? I'm going to show you some practical examples in just a minute. And some of them are going to be focused along this. Have students take on challenges that you didn't think they could do, or maybe a teacher didn't have enough resources or time or context to help them do. So challenge them more. Enhance and diversify practice across a range of scenarios. Again, there's a question of what you can do, but sometimes AI can allow you to look at scenarios because you say, well, I only have these resources, but the AI can generate more resources for a range of scenarios. And ultimately, this is the level at which you're thinking at the augmentation. Can you use the AI as a thinking partner, not to replace the work that you're doing, but to do things like ping pong back and forth? Can you help me brainstorm? Can you help me critique? Can you help point out things that I might have missed and help me think about how I might not miss them or think about them differently? At the modification level, we're talking about shifting the target of the activities, okay? So now you're saying, well, what am I going to change? Well, one of the things I can look at the activities I have from what I did before, and I can say, let me change the activity, so I'm changing what the target is. So for instance, say I have students try to understand ecosystems around Singapore, but now I changed the target, because before it might have been a narrow spectrum. I might have said, well, I'm interested in students learning about these ecosystems because of reasons X, Y, and Z that are intrinsic to biology and ecosystems and a certain type of thing. That's valuable. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to lose that. That's important. But now I can say, but what will the student do with that ecosystem? Why does the student care? And here we have 3 different students. One is interested in the interaction of environment and culture. Huge topic. Fascinating topic. Any of you with degrees in anthropology knows exactly what I'm talking about, the richness of this. And you have a student who's interested in that, but maybe before, not enough time, not enough resources to do it. But now we're shifting the target. So we're not just talking about those intrinsic elements, we're going to keep them, but we're talking about how they're going to play with that interaction. Another one is a future engineer, and they're interested in the technologies they might build for eco-friendly, particularly in the context of climate change. A third one might be a deeply interested student in biological sciences that wants to get into a depth of the topic that they could not have done before because you didn't have the times, the resources, and so on. And you have all of this, and these students can it's not that they each go off and do this whole thing, but AI, in addition to providing the context and the tools for them to explore this in shifting this target, can also help build common languages among them that can mediate that can allow them to cross-embed these contexts they are interested in. Finally, a redefinition. Okay, at this point is where we're creating something new, and here's what we're talking about: true innovation, deep innovation, leveraging AI as a true creative partner. So you're talking about breaking out traditional roles and sequences, and now you're looking for this trilogy, okay? And I know this trilogy sometimes gets defined differently, so differentiate, individualize, and personalize. I view this as sort of a build-on. Differentiate is when you say this student needs different resources than this student to learn the same topic. That's differentiation. Very basic, I know. People who work in special education here are saying, well, hold on, yes, I'm aware, I'm just trying to provide a kind of quick, compact definition here. Individualized learning is now saying, well, this student will work best with this if they encounter topics A, B, and C. This student should look at the same topics, but should encounter them in order C, A, B. And this other student actually needs topic D, which is not needed by the others. So that's when we're talking about individualized, and personalized is when we take all of this and we build it into the context of the student's interests, drive, future life, community life, everything they can build. So that's when we're building personalized learning. And again, we've always wanted to do this, but it's difficult. It takes teachers, it takes resources. Mr. Toad talked about the fact that you have sometimes limited teaching resources and you have to share them with others, and you make better use of those resources, richer, deeper. The answer is yes. And you want to retain two things. You want to retain student agency, very important. A student, to me, it's true of our level in SAMR in general. It's particularly true in the context of AI that the richest, deepest uses of SAMR at the R level are those that involve full student agency, true agency. Not just saying, I'd like to learn about this topic, and then you tell the student, great, I'm going to tell you what to learn, and that's it. But a full range of agency, of action, interaction, sharing, etc. And also the social learning. You heard me already say, I don't like the idea of a student sitting alone in front of a screen without a teacher. We don't want to throw that away. If anything, we want at the R level to enhance it, to use the technology to deepen that social aspect. So take that example I mentioned at the M level of the 3 students, but think about what that could look like this. All right. This is the general picture I want to give you before we wrap and go to the breakouts, concrete examples, because I know that this is useful for people to be able to not just say, okay, I get the general idea, let's get some concrete pictures. And I'm using a tool from another model I developed called the EdTech Quintet, which takes technologies available to education and classifies them into 5 categories according to their, it's not just the particular tool, but how the tool is used. And I'll go through these because it turns out that some tools, for instance, tended to be useful mostly in one category or 2 or so. AI is unusual in the sense that it's useful across all categories of the EdTech Quintet. So I'm going to use that as a guiding principle to show you 5 exemplars, some of them are multiple exemplars as we'll see, of how you can do this go-to modification and or redefinition levels. So all the examples I'm going to show you, I'm not going to show you the augmentation, substitution and augmentation levels. I'm just going to show you to get your minds thinking about what can AI do that is either a deep modification or something new altogether. Let's start with social. Okay, social, assuming most of you have seen Vygotsky and learning, and we know in Vygotsky and learning, one of the reasons that Vygotsky and learning as social learning is so effective is that a student, when they're on their own, can do some things, the zone of current development, in context or interactions with a group, in active interactions, just putting them in a group doesn't do it. And copying, it has to be in active interactions. You have a zone of proximal development where they can do more than they could do on their own, even by themselves in the context of the group. Then with independent practice, that zone of proximal development becomes integrated into a new zone of current development. And then you can build a ZPD on top of that, etc. And there's lots of studies to show that not only is this valuable, it is an accelerator. It both provides greater depth and greater speed in terms of learning. Great. So what could we use AI for? Well, we could use it, for instance, to role play other people in the group. So it could be a more knowledgeable other. It could also be part of the group of independent practice. Wonderful. So to provide perspectives, approaches that you couldn't get otherwise. But also think of it as a bridge to other students. Remember what Mr. To was talking about? Remember what Ake was talking about with HoloTracker and everything else? This is what we're talking about. This is the payoff, and you can tie AI to HoloTracker. Ake has seen me do it in Brazil. And you're going to see some examples of that in just a minute, and help students do that. So let me show you an example here. Suppose that we have students working in climate change and how to change communities in the context of climate change. So we need to talk about communities, architecture, the functions of a city, the function of urban spaces. This actually, if any of you has ever taught the topic, is difficult. It's difficult because people don't really think about what role do doors play if you line up all the doors straight out versus if they're staggered. They don't think about the role of paths. You need some way to help them think through it. Now, fortunately, Christopher Alexander, back in the late 60s, early 70s, worked on exactly this topic, and he came up with a series of design patterns. It's a beautiful set of books. I strongly recommend reading it, but they're not easy to read. They were designed for communities to use, and they were used successfully, but they take some work, some effort. So they've been used mostly in specialized contexts and specialized communities, but they can be a rich resource for students who are saying, hey, we need to change how communities, how we build, how we live in the context of climate change. Can you use these? Well, the answer is yes. But the way Alexander was looking at this in the late 60s, early 70s isn't necessarily that useful for the students. So I can ask the AI, and here it's ChatGPT 4, can you give me different taxonomies that might align in different ways to those different student interests and approaches? One here is an architectural scale, another one is on community needs, perceptions, and interactions. I could keep on playing this game. Here are the prompts. You can try for yourselves and come up with other interactions. So that's creating a rich way for my students to access to something they couldn't have done before. And additionally, I can also use it to adapt to different levels, because what I just showed you would be fine for a college or a university or secondary student, but not the language isn't necessarily appropriate for a primary school student. Okay, here I've asked Sonnet to rewrite one of these taxonomies so that a child can understand it, and lo and behold, here we have it. Again, you've got the prompts. You can try them for yourselves. This is rich. This allows me to both create tools that create common ground for students to share interests, find interests. They're all referencing that, but each of them has a taxonomy that allows them to focus in a way that might better reflect their interests. And they have a common language. It's even a common language that can stretch across age boundaries. Mobility, that refers to the capacity to use tools anytime, anywhere. Well, I can run AI right now, anytime, anywhere, on my phone, on a tablet, whatever. And it's a curiosity amplifier, because I can use that immediately to say, here are some pictures. Show me. Can you tell me what they all have in common? AI, can you tell me what this is? Can you tell me to keep driving the language I might use to talk about something more deeply, not just say that's a bird, but what's interesting about this bird? Not just the Latin name of the bird. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what role does this bird have, stories associated with it? Remember what I said about the interest for an anthropological approach to culture and this? Maybe I'm a child and I've always found that pretty bird outside my window fascinating. Tell me a story about that bird, and the bird is in front of me. It's not something that's, it's embedding my interest, my creativity in the world. And guess what? I'm not going to talk about it today, but XR builds this further. Prop, just so you know, I don't just talk about AI and XR. You know, here we go. These are my XR glasses. These happen to be the Ray-Bans, but there are others. Okay. And one of the reasons I use them is precisely to understand what could happen next. They're not ready yet. I'm not going to say go out everybody and buy one. There are some issues. But it is clearly opening new vistas. What does this look like from a practical approach? Here's an image, and I want to show you a particularly rich example, because sometimes you see, well, yeah, I know Google Images, it tells me it's a bird, but usually gets the bird wrong and so on. That's not where AI is right now. So there's Lava 5 3 Mini, one of the open source artificial engines for recognizing images. And I just asked it to describe this image, which was created by a friend and colleague of mine, Brian Alexander, using Midjourney, an AI engine. And you see, it gives me a rich description, a narrative description that even hypothesizes aspects, gets into, what it does composition-wise. Think of a student interacting with the world. You've got an amazing set of museums in Singapore. I love being in Singapore just to be able to go to the museums among 10,000 other wonderful things to do. Think of a student interacting with those paintings, drawings, sculptures, etc., using a tool like this to help amplify. And also, I haven't shown you here, but you can also adapt this. This would be appropriate, once again, secondary, even upper primary student, but you want to make it easier for a younger child, no problem. You can just say, but make it simple for the child. In fact, the child can say, I didn't understand this. Can you make this simpler or explain it to me? They'll do it. So again, it's not replacing this child. It still has something driving their curiosity. They'll go do something with this image, but the AI makes something uniquely possible. Visualization. Okay, visualization takes abstract concepts and makes them tangible. You take space, you make it into a map. You take time, you make it into a timeline, etc., etc. You make data and you make it into a graph. Many things we can do with AI here. For the math side, I could spend hours talking about how you integrate generative AI with tools like Wolfram Alpha, with tools for construction of little math applets like GeoGebra, etc. And you can do incredible things. But that's not where I want to go in my example today. Let's talk about making the structures of what makes knowledge itself visual. So we can put concept maps together. Now, those of you who use concept maps know that concept maps can be tricky. Concept maps can be tricky because at the introductory level, students generally don't know to put enough richness or how to put enough richness in a concept map for it to be useful. So then you have to supply them. But if you're supplying them with the easiest concept maps, then how do they build up the knowledge to build up more complex maps? Guess what? The AI can help scaffold that process. So you can do this richly. But you can also not just scaffold, you can say to the students, hey, look at areas of knowledge you never thought about. Look at structures that tell you how knowledge interacts with a community. Can you create this? Can you look at some of those drawings you were exploring with the previous type of AI and see how it's connected? So here's an example. The context of the polycrisis is going to require deep thinking. It's going to require rich thinking. And in the context of that, you're going to need to look at not traditionally very basic approaches to ethics. I don't know if anybody here uses trolley problems to explain ethics. I hate to tell you, but those don't work. Okay, nobody really takes away very much, I'm sorry to say, from trolley problems. They're fun. But when people have tested, okay, so those students learn how to think ethically from trolley problems, you have a person on one line, you throw a switch and so many people will die, etc. That type of problem really doesn't help. It's too simplified and doesn't have enough of the richness of the world. So what if I asked them, what if I said, well, traditional philosophy is, of course, a pressure trope for this, but it's complicated. Well, what if I asked the AI to help me explain philosophers? And here I said, okay, you know what? Let's take Kantian ethics. So if you've ever taught Kant or Hegel, it ain't easy. There's a lot of complexities, interactions, and so on. And I've actually found very few books that do a good job. But guess what? I just pointed my AI. This is, again, you'll be able to download, when you download the slides, or if you download slides, you'll have all the pieces. This is running on my own machine at home on an open source AI. It's using a variant of Mistral Nemo, and it's running an engine that scrapes a website, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and then says, hey, can you build a map that shows me how Kantian ethics is constructed, and starts to give me a visualization. I might want to delve into it, prune it, look at subsets, but it helps me do this. You're going to say, well, wonderful for a secondary or high school student, but a secondary or, university student, but what about a younger child? Oh, they can also use this for this. Obviously not just for this type of concept, but you know what? I am going to stick with philosophy and ethics because it is a crucial component of dealing with the polycrisis, with thinking about how all these pieces fit together: philosophy, ethical thinking, cognitive philosophy, etc., nosology, etc. And there is a school that's called Philosophy in the Classroom. Matthew Lipman was one of the first people to do this. But again, one of the things is, can students learn, even very young students, from philosophy in the classroom? Yes. How young? Hi, I've done research. In my experience, kindergarten works just fine, and you can build out from there. That's how young you can start. But the language has to be adapted. Matthew Lipman wrote a series of books. They're great. You might want to update them a little, but they're overall pretty good. And there have been many other people following in the philosophy in the classroom, philosophy for children vein since. But one of the questions is, what's in that? So here I ask Claude to say, tell me what the themes are in Pixie, and put them in a way the teacher can use, put them in a deep way the teacher can use, and I'll give them to a student in a way they can understand. So again, they're still going to be dealing with Pixie. They still have to go through the ethical thinking, but I've made it easier, more accessible for them to understand this. Storytelling. We have textbooks. We have lots of textbooks. But do the images, narratives, all these pieces in the textbook correspond to what the student needs or wants to read? Not necessarily, sadly. And again, it's a question of resources. We only have so many resources, but we can generate that. And can we have them both get stories, narratives generated for them with appropriate support? So here's, again, the role of the teacher becomes crucial on how to help the student so you don't wind up with junk, basically, resulting from this. How does the teacher themselves think of new ways that the student might not have thought about to go about this? But also consider what the students themselves can create in terms of stories with a rich series of options that they might not have been able to do. The student might have wanted to create, say, a movie or a song, but they don't have the musical skill. They'd love to acquire it, but it takes time to learn to play an instrument. Trust me, I know that personally. It takes time to learn how to draw, etc. And many students will get frustrated because they say, I know what's in my head, but I can't get it out there. Well, the AI can help them do that. And in telling stories to each other, they make meaning for each other. And in making meaning for each other, they make meaning for themselves. So here's an example. Let's go back for a second to the case that we were talking about earlier of students thinking about what happens with ecosystems, what happens with communities that they change, right? That's where we start with the social. Okay, now they're making stories. Think of how rich this could be. They're summarizing, but they're using things like saying, well, this filmmaker has told this story in this way relative to environments, because that's what we were talking about earlier. In this way, can I use that to help me think about this? And once again, here's an example with a prompt for Stable Cascade for a student at the secondary to university level. But here's the prompt for a student at an elementary level. They can explore. Each of them will have different set of touchstones of filmmakers, stories, etc., that they're leveraging on, different interests in the context, but they can all explore how do you use this tool of narrative, of filmic context, of images, etc., to explore thinking about how communities need to change in the face of climate change. Last, but far from least, gaming. And let's face it, a lot of educational gaming is just disguised multiple choice. Not much fun. It's okay, but everybody gets a little tired of it after a while. So instead, you can have an AI role play with a student, and that's great. But let's think even more deeply and richly. One way to have students engage with history is to have them role play at the deep level, not just a superficial, okay, let's pretend you're X, but actually engage with personalities, with historical moments, historical roles, and then create scenarios where they're debating each other, arguing, in some cases fiercely arguing, but respectfully, of course, with each other as though they were fill in the blank, a trader in an era, an engineer in another, a politician in another, whatever. And this approach, which is called reacting to the past for this type of role play, has been done, of course, physical, with students in the flesh. And I see no reason to get rid of it. But guess what? Here's yet another case, ChatGPT 4, where I asked ChatGPT, can you please design a game that the students are going to play physically? The students are not necessarily going to use the AI to play a game, although they might use it to create illustrations, to help them prepare audio. If it's say they want to say, hey, I'm a politician, I'm going to put together this political ad for my party, whatever it is, in the context of this. Lots of things they could do for it. But the core of the game is something that's being designed by the AI. And it's not that the AI takes over. If I'm a teacher, I'm going to look at what this produces and say, that's not quite right. Could you touch that up? And some things I'm just going to go in and touch up myself. But I'll be honest with you. I've done RTTP for many years. And it used to take me to design a good game. I could do it in a month. Now I can do it in under a week, less than that. I can even have a workable game in a day with a certain richness and depth that would have been hard for me to do all the necessary research, come together with the bits and pieces, etc. So this is not just a time-saving tool. It's a tool that actually allows me to say, not just say, okay, I'm going to do this one RTTP because that's all the time I have, and somebody fortunately wrote the book for it because I don't even have the time to do it myself, but to actually sculpt this, to have the students sculpt this around their historical interests and whatnot. All right. So, second, that. There we go. One more thing. And this is where I'm going to wrap up. So far, I've been talking about all these things in the context of classroom, teachers, students. But there's a bigger picture. Suppose you're analyzing surveys, and this could be at any stage, anybody. It could be you as a school leader. It could be a teacher. It could be anybody. It could be somebody using the HoloTracker data. Can you use this to analyze surveys? And the answer is yes. And here are some sample prompts. And guess what? This isn't just a play example. This is what I actually ran on the answers to the questionnaires, to the 2 survey questions that all of you answered. And again, I thank you deeply for it. And these are the results. For question 1, the AI, using those prompts, identified 9 themes that can be grouped into 3 separate groups. So the first group is technology integration and its impact, focusing on increased technology use and integration, blended learning models, and personalized learning and adaptive tools as themes. 2 is human aspects and challenges, with technology enhancing, not replacing human connection, the challenges of maintaining human connection, social, emotional learning, and well-being. And number 3, evolving roles and future considerations, teacher role evolution, digital divide and skill gap, future trends. You've also got the ones for question 2. I'm not going to keep on reading this. I just want to give you an idea. You are going to actually be using these tools to answer a series of essential questions or fundamental key central questions today. And I'm going to, just in a minute, turn it over to Ake to just give you that. You're also going to have, in addition to details about those groupings and about each one, you're going to have more information. You're also going to have some visualizations of how all these concepts are connected. Why? Because you need to think about connections in these types of concepts, these types of central topics, issues that you're dealing with in education. In a way, let's go all the way back to our context of the poly crisis as a backdrop. In a way, what we're asking you to do today and to do, hopefully you'll find this useful in your schools, institutions, organizations, is to use this triangle where you say, well, we have the idea of, at the top, whole person learning. You already heard from Mr. Cho and from Ake already how important that is. But in addition to that, the two topics I hope I've convinced you today that are worthwhile looking at are using anti-fragility and SAMR as tools for guiding your thinking and your design, with AI as a crucial component running through all of this, but at the same time, the backdrop of the poly crisis, where you start to think about some of these topics that you saw on that diagram and say, well, how do I start to engage my students with the type of complexity, richness, powerful aspects of thinking? How do I engage communities? How do I engage teachers and students and communities all at the same time in that process? So let's say, Ike is going to take this for a second, but you're going to be engaging with the central question. The first one has to do with reimagining the role of the teacher. So how do you think overlapping challenges over the past 2 years have changed the way teachers work and connect with students? What surprising opportunities have you noticed? And where do you think we might have missed a chance to grow or adapt? We're going to ask you to work on this using the themes I just described. You're going to have breakout rooms, so you can pick one of the 3 categories, which come along with then 3 themes under those 3 themes, under those categories. And again, keep that triangle I just showed you in the back of your mind. So I'm just going to turn it over to Ake in just a second, but I want to thank you for your time. I want to point you to actually the comment in the chat about Christopher Alexander, because I think it's an excellent and thoughtful reflection, okay? And I think there's a question where I think it's worth discussing. Is it or isn't appropriate for a student who is working on design theory or design philosophy to analyze Alexander's ideas? It's a good question. I'm actually going to abstain from replying to that one way or the other, because I think for those of you who might be interested in the topic, I want to leave it as a question to be analyzed. This is part of what I'm hoping this can do. This is part of what I'm hoping you can use this scaffolding to do, to help you look at questions like this and say, well, how do we answer them? Are there different answers? Are there different approaches? Can we run different types of tests? At any rate, I would like you now to be able to go to your breakout rooms and engage with tasks. So, Ake, first, thank you all again very much. And Ake, it's over to you.
In my breakout room, maybe perhaps I just made mention about some of the comments that was made pertaining to culture building, starting with the power of one, and then how with another person, it was made mention about how they could lower the barrier of resistance by maybe having a simple prompt that can cut, copy, and paste into in the form of template. All those are barriers in which it can be lowered. And more importantly, is the generation of the resources to shift the whole entire culture towards that of adoption rather than fearful. And more importantly, when one of the other participants made mention, Mani mentioned something about that of convincing self to let go of what we're very familiar with and to, at least do something different with what you have in tools and to get a small step started. One even mentioned about how do we see textbook passages and so on that can be converted into songs or drama and things like that to allow the students to learn better. So that pull factor of that draw coming using technology to shortcut. I won't say shortcut. One of them even mentioned about that of designing the best lesson that previously you would not have the affordance of time to use it. And then how do you actually use it to design that with the help of AI? Something similar to what it did about the parrot on the shoulder. Okay, somebody to bounce off, or AI to bounce off the ideas with, and to create that particular part. I thought it was very, very inspiring to hear that the whole entire group, in all the groups I've visited and so on, they are very positive over that of how they can navigate in this AI era. Thank you. Thanks, group 2. I think was it group 2 or 4? Anyway, in the group I was in, there was Wani, Xiu Yu, Charmaine, and Ming Ye in my team. Charmaine Ko. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the rich sharing. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Ruben, anything from your team?
Yes. In fact, if I had to synthesize, what I heard I was some room for, I would synthesize that if we're framing this into actions, I would say that if I had to extract a summary, it would be actions in two directions, and they're both actions for giving space. One is an action for giving space for teachers to have time to develop, to do things like marking, etc., things that are important to teachers' work, but that take up amounts of time. And that, frankly, it's not just the time, but it's also, you get tired. At the end of the day, you'd like to do something that isn't just marking up papers and then go on to learn something new about AI and so on. So this is one way of giving space, right? This is space for saying, use the AI so that teachers now have more time to both think about how they might use the AI, as well as explore aspects. What's it all about? What can you do? And so on. So that's one type of space. And the second type of space that I heard being talked about, and it's also very important, is the space of knowledge in an actionable or usable form. In other words, how do you get the forms of knowledge, whether it's in, communities of practice, knowledge guides, professional development? What's the best or more appropriate or best suited to the needs and the time and the focus of teachers? How do you give them the space of this is the knowledge that you need, this is how you can explore, and so on? So, I think we all understand that that's going to be very different from one group to another, but at the same time, there's a common core of elements that we can look at, elements that we can say these are resources so that teachers don't have to reinvent the wheel when there's a change in tool X or tool Y goes away and is replaced by tool Z. One of the interesting things I will say about Gen AI is that if you're working at the prompt level, there's actually more consistency than we've seen in the past with other tools. In other words, a good prompt strategy might differ a little between ChatGPT and Claude and the open source Llama series, say, but less than it might have been, say, if you were talking about video tools and using Premiere versus Final Cut Pro versus iMovie, which could actually be quite different in more ways than one, right? So there is, fortunately, something that I'm hoping will remain the case, might not, of a certain commonality of interface that helps with this. But at the end, you do need to have that space. Make sure you grant the space, the resources, etc., for teachers to have that in hand and to not feel like it's a train that they can not catch up with because they're not, it's going a little bit too fast to jump on as it's leaving the station. So those are the two aspects of spaces. And again, my thanks to everybody in the group because it was an amazing discussion. So
Awesome. Thank you so much for this session, everybody. And I think what we have really come in to explore, I think today has been, we talked a lot about AI and the potential of AI, but I think a lot of us are also thinking about that educator's role and what it means for the educators to become the designers in the next future of education, right? And here I really wanted to bring up some observations from people. Risham, I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly. Teachers as designers, adapting our teaching strategies to suit online and hybrid learning environments. We talked also about the potential for Gen AI to support language learning, right, as a learning companion to our students. We saw also, I think there was building connection and leveraging online platforms to build rapport with our students. And this is also where I would encourage us to go, if you haven't already, to the Reflect page on HoloTracker, and this is where you can hear some of the thoughts that are bubbling in the room. All right, so We have about 5 minutes left. Here I wanted to invite, is there anybody who feel very compelled that you want to share something with the group? If not, I'll proceed to conclude the session, but maybe I should hold space for that first. Anybody would like to share out? Right. If we don't, I think one thing that I can do just to help us to conclude this session is really to I've done this already, so I've invited us to give ourselves a final pat on the back. If there's something you feel invigorated or inspired to work on, feel free to continue to share it on the platform. This will continue to be open, so we are now a bit of a community here that we can see each other's insights. There is a little hidden feature of Follow Tracker that I think will help us to see the potential of AI in a small way, right? So this is really a small, I like to call it a souvenir in our learning conferences, where we each actually have now the ability to generate a little report for ourselves. So let me show you how we can do that. So if I'll show us on the screen, and maybe you can follow along with me. So if you're on the Reflect page, what we can do is to go to members. And since I put him on the spot, I'm going to use his profile here. So let's say we go to your own profile, right? In this case, I'll use Visham's profile. You can actually create a little affirmation card, and we've designed a prompt. We've talked a lot about prompt design today. We've designed a prompt that allows us to summarize your reflections for this session. So if anyone would like to go back into your profile and see what it will look like, this is one way you can do so. And if you download the card, you should receive a little souvenir just for this session. Again, this is really a feel good at the end of the exercise. I think what is the real insight here is all the discussions that we've had today. Right. So as we conclude the session, one thing I really want us to help us with is that this is actually our first workbench, or at least our first workbench of this size. And I would love to also collect some of your feedback from the session. So if you could help the HoloTracker team with this little feedback survey, that would be amazing. It just has 2 questions. I promise people on HoloTracker that we never ever have long surveys. So just 2 questions that will take 5 minutes. It's really how are you feeling about the session and what's one thing that you take away from it. So yeah, with that, I think that concludes my side. Ruben, Mr. To, any last words that you would like to share with the team? Maybe 1 minute concluding sentence.
Maybe I'll start first. I think it has been very exciting. I would like to, on behalf of IC as well as that of Ruben, thank all of the participants for your active participation. One of the thoughts that crossed my mind usually would be, will the number dwindle by the end of the session? But you can see from the numbers itself, we're very blessed to see that all of us are excited to see where technology and human ingenuity can converge to create that particular experiential learning for our kids. And with all of your thoughts and ideas, I think the unified move towards that of adapting ourselves and reshaping education for a better workforce in the future tense. Thank you so very much. It's been very inspiring having seen all of your contributions and reflections. Thank you.
Ruben?
Oh, thank you.
Ruben?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. To. Yeah, I was going to say first my thanks to everybody here. I was, really, deeply gratified to see the engagement and the depth of thought in the conversations I was, able to, participate in. So thank you all. It's really a rich experience. And for me, it's the beginning of conversations. We are looking at a new world of tools. And as I said, this is a complicated world. But one of the things that people always ask me is, so are you, very pessimistic? No, quite the contrary. In other words, I think that with the type of thinking, attitudes, yes, caution at times, but also yes, desire to get beyond fear, to create new things, to explore new avenues. I think we can really, as Mr. Toh has said, create a world for our students, for our teachers, and for our communities that really looks at new possibilities and new directions, and that uses these tools to create some quite wonderful things. So I want to thank you all for coming and for being willing to talk, share, and keep the conversation hopefully going after this. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody.